Okay, so we're not going to take a ton of notes. I know that's kind of weird because you're facing that way technically, so just kind of turn a little bit. But anything that I write on the board, you want to write down. It's not going to be a ton, okay? So we're starting with this idea. Ooh, that doesn't look like an H. My handwriting is also not, I'm not in practice of writing neatly on the board, so sorry. The hero archetype. What is an archetype? Are you familiar with that phrase at all?
Yeah.
What is an archetype?
No.
It's a type of character, right? So when we talk about an archetype in any type of literature, it's just a certain sort of stereotypical type of character that you see in different pieces. So we're talking about the hero archetype, which is a fascinating concept because you can trace this kind of character through pretty much any culture, pretty much any time period, and see a ton of similarities. So again, an archetype is a specific type of character in literature. Miss Oliver. Hey, I'm doing notes and recording, so I'll call you back. Okay, so we are looking at this idea of the monomyth that a guy named Joseph Campbell originally came up with. So monomyth meaning what do you think? One myth, right? One story. So they outlined this in the video, but the concept of the monomyth is that basically Joseph Campbell started thinking about all of these ancient stories through all of these classical pieces of literature, and he basically said that they are all different types of the same type of story. You can trace these similar elements, these similar character traits, this cycle of events through any one of these stories, and it's extremely accurate, and it's still very relevant today. So that's what we're looking at. And he said that the reason you can trace this through so many different cultures and areas is because it mimics the human experience. It mimics the human experience. And what he meant by that was this idea of being called to do something that's different than what we normally do in facing challenges and getting help along the way and figuring it out and eventually achieving it or not, but coming out of it, learning something and starting over. That's kind of what life is, right? That's what we do. And so Campbell's argument was that in order to reflect that, because art generally reflects life, this sort of story cycle was created. So at this point, I'm going to draw a diagram and label mine on the circle. If you would rather draw a small diagram and just number the steps and write it out next to it, that's totally up to you. Okay? So that's not a bad circle. Yesterday my circle was real wonky. All right, so it is a cycle, and the cycle is divided in half. And the top half is the ordinary world, the normal life where the hero lives. And the bottom half is the special world. It's important for us to know that this circle doesn't necessarily represent the length of the plot that's allotted to these things, and you'll see what I mean by that in just a second. All right, so our 0 at the top of the circle is the status quo. The status quo, which is sort of like your normal. So as we talk through this, I want us to use a current example. So are y'all familiar with the movie Finding Nemo? Pretty familiar with Finding Nemo. Okay, we're going to use that as our example. So, if we're talking about Finding Nemo, our status quo normal at the beginning of the movie is Marlin and his little fishy wife, and they're just living their little fishy life, right, in the reef. And then we have kind of a little mini crisis when Nemo's mom gets eaten, which is really sad, okay? So then our status quo from there is Marlin and Nemo. Marlin's super scared all the time, right? That's their normal life, living in the reef, taking Nemo to school. That's where we start with status quo, okay? Then our 1 o'clock is the call to adventure, number 1. Which is when your hero is given a task. So number 1 is your call to adventure, which is when your hero is given a task. So what task is Marlin charged with? Finding his son Nemo, right? Nemo gets taken by the boat, and Marlin has to find him. Number 2, tell me if I'm going too fast, okay? Number 2 is assistance. Every hero has a sidekick, right? Yeah, that's how it works generally. Every hero needs help. So you have assistants. They have a sidekick or a helper that comes along to aid them. So who would it be in Finding Nemo? Dory, right? Dory is his helper. Now, in some types of stories, your sidekick or your helper may be supernatural in some way. When you're talking about classic hero stories, meaning like mythology, right? A lot of times those heroes, if you think about Hercules or Odysseus or any of those, their help is often from a supernatural person or individual, or they get a magic sword, or they get whatever. Some sort of supernatural tool that's going to help them. In more modern day hero stories, it's often a person that serves as the help. Okay? Number 3, which it's important that number 3 is on the line, because number 3 is your departure. And your departure can be literal or figurative. Here's what I mean by that. In Finding Nemo, does Marlin actually leave his world? No, he's still in the ocean, he's still on Earth, right? So he doesn't technically go to a different world. However, he leaves his little reef that he's familiar with, right? And the great big open ocean might as well be like a different world. So in that story, it's a figurative departure. He does physically go to a different place, but it's still within his world. Sometimes in some stories, they're going actually to a different world, to the underworld, a lot of times in classical hero stories, to another planet, to some sort of magical realm. It just sort of depends on the story. But there's some sort of departure, some sort of change is number 3. All right, and then number 4, trials. And these trials test the hero's strength, both physically and morally. So these trials could be monsters that they have to defeat. They could be tasks that they have to complete. They could be anything like that. And it tests them physically. Can they survive? Are they strong enough? But a lot of times it also tests them morally. Will they choose to do the right thing? Will they choose to be honorable or honest or whatever it is? So in Finding Nemo, what are some of the tests that Marlin goes through? What can you think of? What does he have to face along the way?
Oh yeah, that little shark Anna thing.
Yes. Yes. Jellyfish, sharks. There's the whale thing, right? That eats him.
The birds.
The seagulls, right? All trials. So if we're talking about the length of the story, this section between departure and number 5 is probably one of the longer chunks of your story. Because the trials are usually the bulk of the story, right? That's the good stuff. It's the fighting, it's the surviving, it's all of that. So just know that that's what I meant when I said this circle doesn't necessarily represent equal parts of the story. The bulk of your story is going to happen over here, okay? So number 5 is the approach. And the approach is when the hero is approaching the main conflict and they have a chance to give up, right? Think about any hero, superhero story that you can think of. At some point, the hero always has the chance or is tempted to just give up and say, forget it, I can't do it, it's not possible. There are several of these in Finding Nemo, right? Marlin struggles a little bit with this one because he almost gives up in The Whale. He almost gives up when they lose Nemo when he's at the dentist. He almost gives up when he loses Dory, right? There's several different times that Marlin nearly gives up. But each time, who helps him to not give up? Dory. So a lot of times in the cycle, your approach is when your sidekick, your assistant, some supernatural something, a lot of times comes and keeps them from quitting. Have y'all seen The Lord of the Rings? Okay, some of you have, some of you haven't. So there's what I think is one of the best examples of the approach in all of story and film history. It's in the last Lord of the Rings film. So the whole premise of Lord of the Rings, if you're unfamiliar, is you have Frodo, who's this little hobbit dude, and he has this ring that he has to destroy. It's basically the premise of all however many movies that there are. And he has to destroy it in this specific volcano, okay? So it's this whole like 4 or 5 movie saga of all these issues that they face. And it's him and his buddy Sam, okay? This is a little hobbit friend. So it's at the end of the movie and they finally have made it to this volcano and they've gotten through all the super scary dudes that are trying to eat them. And they're at the bottom, like they're going up the side of the volcano and Frodo just like collapses. And he's like, I can't do it anymore, Sam. I can't go on. And in this great moment of approach triumph, there's like this really dramatic music. Because there's also this like magic thing where Frodo's the only one that can carry the ring. Sam can't take it. And so it's this moment and they're all like bloody and dirty and they're all exhausted. And Sam says, Mr. Frodo, I can't carry the ring, but I can carry you. And he like scoops him up on his back and like trudges the rest of the way out the volcano. And there's this great dramatic music and it's just very moving and wonderful. And they throw it in the volcano, okay? That's the approach, right? You're heading towards the final conflict. The hero may not make it. Maybe the hero's not the right one. And then generally the helper comes along and is like, no, you can do it. You can do it. I believe in you. And then they keep going, okay? That's the approach. And they finish at the crisis, which is the main conflict. Okay, remember the plot diagram? Kind of looks like a little squiggly line with a mountain on it. You may have done those also before. Yeah, looks like a mountain. Top of the mountain, the climax of the story, is the main crisis point. This is the main conflict with the villain or the antagonist or whatever, the monster that they're fighting. This is the big moment, the big battle, whatever it is, this is where it happens, okay? Sometimes in some stories, depending on how complex, you may have kind of multiple goes at this section, multiple crisis moments, but generally there's one you can identify as the primary crisis. And then at the end of that crisis, the hero has the treasure. And the treasure is something that the hero has gotten or obtained because he made it through the crisis. So in Finding Nemo, what is Marlin's treasure? Nemo, right? His son. Sometimes it's a person. Sometimes it's actual gold or money. Sometimes it's an actual object. Sometimes it's safety, right? Because they've defeated whatever monster, the world gets to be safe, and that's the treasure. Sometimes it's getting to be king, whatever it is. There's a whole tons of different things that the treasure can be. And then number 8 is the result. And the result, I feel like my handwriting is getting worse as we go around, sorry. The result is how the crisis ends. So if the crisis was a battle with a monster, the result is that the monster died, or the result is that the hero got away, right? So this is like, how does the crisis end? Does that kind of make sense? Then number 9 is where we cross back into the ordinary world, and we call that the return. So again, we've got the treasure, the crisis is over, now the hero is going to return back to the ordinary world. But when the hero returns, there is new life. Number 10, new life. Because something is different. Either the situation or the hero, him or herself. So maybe the hero's situation is different. Maybe they get to be king now. Maybe they have a significant other now because they rescued him or her from the treasure, from the crisis. Maybe whatever it is. Sometimes their situation is different. But sometimes, and often more frequently in hero stories, their situation is exactly the same, but the hero is different. So in Finding Nemo, does their situation change? No. Their status quo that they return back to is exactly the same. The movie's almost exactly the same at the end. They're taking Nemo to school, they live in the anemone, but Marlin is who's different, right? He has changed, and so therefore his life is different. And then 11 is sort of returning back to the status quo. And we just call this the resolution, and it's like the end moment. Because you think about in movies when it just kind of shows you that they're back to the status quo, right? There's always that scene, unless they're like holding you for a sequel. There's that scene that just kind of shows you how everything ends, where everybody ends up, all that kind of stuff. So like the resolution scene in Nemo would be when you see that Dory's there and you see that Nemo's happy at school and you see that they're going on with their lives. So you're kind of getting the answers you were looking for in that resolution. Does that make sense? So this is what we call the epic story cycle, or more formally the monomyth cycle. And it's this idea that this pattern, this cycle of events in the story can be traced through, again, any type of hero story throughout cultures and time. It's a pretty cool idea, okay? So to practice this and kind of get it cemented into our brains, what I'd like for you to do is at the bottom of your note sheet or on the back of your note sheet, this is just going to be notes for you. Think of a hero type story that you're familiar with. Pretty much all the Disney movies work, right? Toy Story, Lion King, Mulan, any of those, right? Or like superhero movies work pretty well, pretty much, Harry Potter, whatever. Any kind of action type, hero type movie that you can think of. And I want you to just at the bottom of your paper, you don't have to draw the circle again, but just number 1 through 11 and jot down in your particular story, like what's the call to adventure in Mulan, right? Well, she decides to take her dad's place at war, right? See what I'm saying? And you're just going to you don't have to be complete sentences. We're just going to jot down the examples to kind of help cement this in our minds.